Coming from Saber Interactive, we once again return to Warhammer 40K Space Marine 2. We've already gone in depth on the game's PC version in a preview build, but today we have all the console versions as well, and it being a current gen release, that makes the line of sight PS5, Series X and S, of which, as ever, we have two modes to choose on PS5 and Series X. So, to join me and to talk about the consoles and where the PC version stands right now, I have my good friend and colleague, Alex Battaglia. How's it going?
Hey there, Tom. Yes, I'm wearing my Warhammer 40K themed shirt. I've got my Eldar army right behind me, and I've done some testing here to report on that PC version.
Excellent, excellent. So where to start? Consoles first? What do you reckon?
Yeah, let's get into it, because in this one, we really didn't know what to expect of the console version. Given what we saw in the preview build, we thought it would be a very heavy game, and I think we see that bearing out in what we have collected. Right, Tom?
Yeah, so I'm on point for consoles, and it's been honestly a interesting experience, to say the least, in terms of the performance side, less so the comparison side, which is kind of the other bread and butter focus for us. I guess to quickly rattle off what goes on in the comparisons, we've got two modes, but they're only on PS5 and Series X. We've got the quality mode and a speed mode, as it's called in Warhammer parlance. I'm not sure if this is related to Warhammer lore. Is this, do you know?
No, I think it's just a weird name.
Well, that is our performance mode anyway, and that gives you 60 frames per second, or that's the promise anyway. Right, so comparison side first. In terms of resolutions, we have a dynamic 720p to 1080p in the performance modes, which upscale to 4K via FSR2. We have the quality mode, which bumps that up to 1080p to 1440p as a higher range, which again upscales to 4K. And then on Series S, we have a similar setup to the performance mode in that it's 720p to 1080p, but there it only upscales to 1440p, which is kind of the typical target on Series S. So pretty straightforward there, and I haven't really noticed much in the way of visual differences between them. The visual quality in terms of reflections, textures, shadows, draw distances are a match, and given that the infrastructure of the game, the kind of the basic fundamentals of how it plays are based around all these swarming Tyranids and Rippers as well, you have to have a matching number of AI enemies on screen to make the crossplay work. So that is fixed in place in much the same way as I suppose a good comparison point would be Exoprimal from Capcom, which also had to focus in on a specific number that all consoles could compute the same way. So that's what we've got here, and I've got to say, visually they match up very similarly. The quality modes on PS5 and Series X marginally bump up shadow quality and small details, but it's very, very minor, very subtle, so I wouldn't dwell on that too much. What I would dwell on more is the performance side, where on the 30 FPS quality modes, frankly, this is very tight. Like, I've got no issues, no grievances with how this is playing. It runs really well. Perhaps a one blip every now and then as you catch the renderer off guard by a dynamic res change, and especially in cutscenes where there's a camera flip and there's kind of like they have to re-render in certain effects on the fly. But besides that, it's really robust from what I've played in about the first 3 to 4 hours. That also extends to Series S, surprisingly, though there are a few more blips en route, but otherwise I'm pretty happy with that. And it all suggests to me that Saber Interactive really intended this to be a 30 FPS experience first, and then what then opens out in the performance mode is let's just see what happens by dropping the resolution target, and let's give it a go. 60 FPS as the target there in the speed mode. So it doesn't quite pan out.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to pan out. Basically, based on the PC testing I was doing while Tom was working on his console things, I already noted that the game was pretty heavy both on the GPU and CPU, especially CPU side of things. All those swarming enemies and such, depending upon the scene you're in, can really lower the frame rate on a older CPU, especially below 60 FPS. And that makes for an experience that is, I would say, less than positive, especially on the first point of contact, which was for you PlayStation 5, right?
Yeah, yeah. We'll talk about a tough first impression.
Yeah, not so steady there. Basically, you noted that even in just the first mission, as soon as the enemies started piling up on screen and more started to happen, that's when the frame rate could dip down first into the 50s, for example. And then as more enemies come in, more things happen, it can go down into the 40s. And you even experienced slower in the campaign, correct?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it starts off pretty well with the tutorial bit. You've got the first sort of planet, which is a lot of jungle foliage, but still quite condensed areas, like small arenas, if you like, or dust bowls, which don't encourage too many enemies to appear, and you're usually getting 60 out of Series X and PS5 that way. Where you do start to see a bit of a problem is when it opens out in like military bases, and you have a first set piece with a giant pit in the middle, as all these Tyranids come over the hills in the distance, and they land in the middle, and you've got to take them all down. That's where I saw PS5 going very far down, like into the 40 FPS line. And even we're seeing worse later on PS5, I noticed. There's a set piece, a really cool set piece, when you go into an interior and you think, okay, everything's going to fly at 60 now because there's barely anything taxing the system at this point. But no, Saber Interactive throw in a new mechanic with the flamethrower, and all these tiny creatures, rippers, collect up and into a swarm, quite similar to A Plague Tale Requiem's rats. And at that point, there's no two ways about it. The number of enemies on screen, combining the rippers and the Tyranids in one big battle, there's no chance PS5 can cope with this. So it's not the flamethrower, it's the number of enemies on screen, because as soon as you start to kill off all those waves, that's it. You're free and you're back up to 60. So yeah, we're down into the 30s there on PS5, at worst into the mid 30s. So that was my first exposure to it.
Yeah, not so good there. And based upon what I saw on PC, and I'll get to that later, Ryzen 5 3600 seemed to have similar issues like what we saw on the PlayStation 5. So if you are going to be playing this game and you want the most consistent performance possible, getting up to the 60 FPS line, you definitely want a very beefy CPU.
Yeah, for sure. It's all CPU all the time. But then obviously picked up the Series X version, and there was a marked improvement pretty much across the board from the start. Let's go in order. Tutorial, fine, as expected. But then you get to the pit in the first military base, and suddenly we're at the 60 FPS line, and we're thinking, all right, well, what's going on here? Is this, how is this such an increase? But it is what it is. There are still drops. There are dips into the 50s, mid 50s, but nothing on the level. We're looking at a 10 to 15 FPS boost over the PS5 version, which is significant. That is the difference for me between this game being playable as a 60 FPS mode with a bit of an assistance from VRR if you have that supported. Whereas PS5, the VRR window is obviously reduced to 48 to 60. Series X has a wider range there. And and it has more frames to work with as well. And I guess the last part of that tangent is that the bit with the Ripper, Swarm, and the Flamethrower will take you to a higher frame rate overall. It's not great, but it's still kind of in the 40s, about the 45 FPS mark. So this isn't ideal by any means. There's not much optimization going on in terms of, working around this as the optimized 60 FPS mode. But it is cool that it's available overall, I think, because you can salvage it with the right display technology. Yeah,
in this case, it's a bit strange to see this performance differential. You showed me screenshots from campaign cutscenes where there's a 21% performance advantage for the Xbox Series X, which is on the rarer side that we've seen this generation. And it does make me question what exactly is going on, because visually and the DRS window is going to be the same as we see on PC that I'll talk about in a second. It does seem CPU limited in a lot of scenes, and usually when games are CPU limited between Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5, they run more or less the same. And if they are GPU limited, depending upon the way the game is GPU limited, PS5 can pull ahead sometimes, but we've seen titles like Alan Wake 2 where Xbox Series X really has a distinct advantage. So it's a little weird to see just how generally, regardless of which scene you're in and what may be limiting the PS5 at that very moment, that we see such a healthy Xbox Series X advantage. I do think it is, like you said, actually like it's a game that was 30 FPS and then there's a 60 FPS unlocked mode, but it's not a good 60. I do think that the VRR window on Xbox Series X will help a lot. It'll make it a better experience. But I also do think that the image quality, if you've played a lot of games this generation with FSR2, you should come in knowing what to expect here. Depending upon the scene, it can look a lot better and a lot worse. It's a pretty fuzzy looking game on the 60 FPS modes at times.
Yeah, for sure. In the sort of swampy woodland bits, you can definitely see the impact of FSR on like all the grass and all the particles going on as well. It's always a weak point for FSR's resolve to 4K. So, and they haven't resolved it here. We've got a bit more to say on FSR. Like I believe you've got a bit more to say on FSR's impact on console versus PC. I don't suppose there's much more to say there on console. It seems to be pretty clear cut. We're not getting 60 on either machine locked, but if you are going for one of the two and you're in that luxurious position where you can choose a version between the two, there's no question, like in side-by-side comparisons, especially using cutscenes where it's frame matched. Gameplay's hard to frame match, but in cutscenes it's a marked improvement and more frames per second overall. Which leads us on to the topic of PC, Alex, and I think you've gone deep on this. How's it looking on PC?
I'm kind of so-so on the release in a number of ways, but I'll get to that. One thing to note about the PC, just right at the very beginning, there is a shader compilation step as the game is starting. And as you get into the menu options, there are few of them. I wouldn't say there is as many graphical options as the game should really have. And they don't always scale so well, but they at least do have preview images, for example, that'll give you a sense of what they at least changed in the graphical visual presentation of the game. So that's good. You're going to have FSR2 in there, TAA, which I do not recommend using because it internally, just like if you're using it, it will go up to the native res and then seems to FSR1 scale up above that to whatever your output is. And it looks really chunky and not too great. But yeah, FSR2, DLSS 2. So none of the frame gen components are here, but apparently they're going to be added after launch. The best part, I would say, in the graphical settings menu is the dynamic res option, which is effective. And I'll talk about that soon enough. But it lets you arbitrarily choose the targeted frame rate for the game. And I think that is something to praise in a title like this. Getting into the settings, as Tom was talking about, the game is GPU heavy to a good degree, but also it is very CPU heavy. So when all of the various enemies pile up on screen, that is the limiting aspect of performance. And there aren't settings to scale that because that means changing the game. So you have to come in here knowing that CPU is going to limit your performance, and the best way to get better performance there is to upgrade your CPU. There's not much you can do about it. So that means optimized settings are potentially less meaningful than they are in other titles because getting the steady FPS means actually just having better hardware to a greater degree. Okay, but what about shader compilation? In the preview video, I noted that there are many instances in the preview code where shader compilation stutter or hitches were occurring. I unfortunately have to report that the launch version still has hitches from shader compilation stutter. You can find them in the intro chapter to the game, the prologue. There's just like weird like little things that just cause them to, they just happen all of a sudden. And if you were to go back and play that scene, you realize they're not happening again. For example, here is a recording of me running on the 7800X3D with a RTX 4070 in the machine. I'm just sitting in the corner. And when one of these spore pods hits the ground, the effect that shows up there causes a frame time hitch. Play the scene again, it disappears. Then when I delete the shader cache on the PC and I let the game recompile shaders, which it does do correctly, well, guess what? The shader is no longer in the DirectX shader cache, and then the game hitches again. So it seems like the game still has, most likely throughout the entire campaign, a variety of shader compilation stutters. It will get in the way of smoothness, and it is annoying. So optimized settings, what is there to say there? Well, first, let's start with SSR. If you go down to the default setting, It will notably degrade the visual quality of SSR, seems like in resolution. But if you do that, you get a 10% performance win. And I think if you were looking for optimized settings, you would take that hit and you would use them. Volumetrics, going down to low makes them a little bit too chunky, I would say. Medium, you're scarcely going to see a difference, and you'll get 1% better performance back here as measured on an RTX 4060 at 1080p native. The detail setting, this one changes the two things. First, it changes the tessellation factor on the ground, apparently. And then it also, on the low setting, more noticeably degrades the LOD at a distance. It also degrades it slightly from ultra to medium, but that is less noticeable than it is on low. Here, I would say if you were looking for an optimized setting, medium doesn't look too different from ultra in most scenes. And here I did measure a 1% performance win. So if you were doing that, you could do that. SSAO, the default setting here would be the winning performance combo, 3% performance above the high setting. But as I'll talk about later with comparisons to PS5, it does introduce aliasing into the scene. Also, it lightens the look of SSAO's appearance on geometry. But once again, that's optimized settings for people who are really scrounging. Shadows, I've noticed very little difference in performance here, so I would say just keep it to high. And the other settings were not really measurable in any good way. And I did not notice issues with 8 gigabytes at 1080p, for example, when using the highest texture quality setting in the game, so textures does not seem to be a big issue here. In total, if you were to measure side by side in a heavy scene like this, where it was originally at 1080p native on the RTX 4060, it was around like 40, upper 40s in the FPS, well, you can gain back 19% more performance by using my optimized settings. But I honestly would just recommend instead keeping the settings pretty high and just utilizing dynamic resolution scaling. I've found that when you do use it in combination with the in-game VSync, that it actually keeps really well to your set target. I just ran through this area here. It's dipping all the time there on the side without DRS, but with DRS on, it's a completely flat 60. It isn't perfect. It will have sometimes trouble catching up, but it is way better, I think, than losing visual quality for other others, especially if you're using DLSS. As this recording shows here, though, I did find that if you don't use the VSync option in game, it can sometimes not work so effectively. Like it almost looks like it turns off occasionally. So do keep that in mind. Okay, I also compared to PlayStation 5. As Tom was talking about earlier, there's like the 720p to 1080p range for the DRS, and then it is upscaled by a FSR2 to 4K. But it is using a custom version of FSR2. We were a little confused by it, so we sent off an email and we got an answer back that it is a custom version of FSR2. So if you compare to PC, you'll see that it resolves more detail than internal 1080p rendering. Its edge quality is most similar to 4K Ultra Performance mode, but its internal detail quality, like texture surfaces, for example, is more akin to a little bit below 1440p balance mode. So it has different image quality characteristics than normal FSR2. Another thing that if you look at this comparison here of the differences between SSR in the versions, you'll see that the PS5 version resolves SSR without these like pixelization features, and that'll also apply to certain particles in the game. Basically, it kind of trades the sharpness and pixelness of FSR2 for a kind of blurriness and a softening. But that can be a positive image quality aspect depending upon what you're looking at. I noticed grass is different between PC and PlayStation 5, but there's no option on PC to adjust that. I have no idea why, but it's slightly different. Maybe slightly less dense. It's really hard to know. The detail setting is custom. The LOD is pulled back to around the medium setting, but the deformation on the ground appears to be the low setting. So it's some custom value that doesn't seem to be available on PC there. The texture filtering is really obviously set to medium, which looks like 4x, which is a very typical thing to do for performance mode games, on console there. I noted that SSR is probably set to default, but it's impossible to really know because, once again, FSR2 is different between the titles and it's really hard to tell. Same applies to volumetrics there. And the shadows is a slightly custom setting where it is definitely lower than high, but it is somewhat slightly different to medium. So it's like closest to medium there. And with SSAO, it's really hard to tell and still what the difference would be, but if you move the camera back and forth like I'm doing here, you can see that there is extra aliasing, like flicker, in the default version, and that lines up with exactly what we see on the PlayStation 5 version, so it's probably using something similar to default there. Here, I once again did kind of want to see how CPU limited the game was on console and PC, and I loaded up this one scene from the very beginning of the game with the 7800 X3D, Ryzen 5 3600, and the PlayStation 5 set to its speed mode, and I noted that the PS5 performed almost 1-to-1 with the Ryzen 5 3600 in this one scene, where it was CPU limited on PC for both, CPUs there. So, at the beginning of this generation, we said, oh, Ryzen 5 3600, it's going to be similar to that PS5. Well, in this case, it was very similar. But it still doesn't explain the Xbox Series X performance advantage to me here. I'm still really mystified exactly at what is happening.
That bit especially, the fact we've dialed into the exact settings and we've got a close approximation, a very close match for the hardware CPU side. Very interesting that we're still seeing a Series X advantage. It could be LOD variation on the creatures as they swarm in. There could be a different way it's optimized, and also it's worth saying that we did test on the same latest patch version on both consoles, 1.02 on each. So that is where it is. We can only describe what we're seeing so far. Does that wrap up your thoughts on PC then? Is that everything?
Yeah, I mean, just to say once again, I do wish it was in a slightly better state regarding things like shader compilation. But if you are looking for 60 FPS in the purest form possible, it's really only on PC right now with high-end kit.
Right, well, I think that covers everything. Thank you so much, Alex, for your input on the PC side. Much appreciated.
Of course there, Tom.
And if you did enjoy this video and want to see more, don't forget to check our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net to get in touch directly. You know where to find us. But from me and Alex for now, thanks for watching.